The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Why, hello there, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. The story I have to tell you today is one that has sat, quite literally, at the top of my list for a couple of years now, after being requested more times than I can count. This episode is all about the mysterious and as yet unsolved disappearance of the Manic Street Preachers lyricist and guitarist Richie Edwards. Richie's family have very recently put out a fresh appeal for information about his case. And although this is a very heavy story and does feature mentions of self-harm, addiction, and the possibility of a person taking their own life, so please do be aware of that before choosing to listen today, I do think it's very important that we continue to talk about it. So let's begin. Now, if you're anything like me, when you think of the most impactful rock bands of the 1990s, the Manic Street Preachers will be on the list every time. The group were formed in Caerphilly in South Wales and were a major part of the 90s movement known as Cool Cymru. At this time, there were several prominent bands that emerged from the beautiful country of Wales, including two of my other favourites, Catatonia and Stereophonics. And the Manics became a hugely influential addition to the alternative music scene after first forming in 1986. They had this real rough and ready style and were quite a disruptive force in the music industry. Whilst this meant that they were a little divisive, many adored the band from the outset. Richie Edwards, who was also known as Richie James, was actually the last member to join the Manics and started off as a roadie for the group, driving the van they used to get to and from gigs. As they were all school friends, the other members already knew that Richie was a very intelligent and creative soul, perhaps in his heart more of a poet than a musician, and although he joined the band as both a guitarist and a co-lyricist, I think it's fair to say that he's remembered much more for his words and presence than his guitar playing, and I mean that as a genuine compliment. He had this look which had a haunting, romantic rock star vibe, and articles about his lyrics are still being written to this day. Whilst Richie spoke about having a happy childhood, growing up in his grandmother's house with his beloved pet dog, enjoying school and playing football with his friends, he was open about this shifting as he moved into secondary school. His bandmate and close friend, Nicky Wire, spoke to the NME in 2008 about how Richie excelled academically and would be very disappointed if he didn't receive the grades he was expecting, whilst his sister Rachel has spoken to GQ magazine about some early indications that Richie had a kind of fascination with the idea of escaping buried within him as a teenager, something which we'll explore more shortly. By the time the Manic Street Preachers were emerging into the mainstream, Richie was in his early 20s and began to exhibit certain behaviours that were concerning to those who loved him. In one of the most infamous incidents in 90s music history, whilst the band were being interviewed by former BBC Radio 1 DJ Steve Lamacq in 1991, Lamacq began to question whether the band were being authentic in their approach to the music they created, and Richie's response was both dramatic and troubling. This is rough, so do feel free to skip ahead a few seconds if you'd prefer. Richie actually took out a razor blade and carved the number 4 followed by the word real into his arm, whilst continuing with the interview. The wounds were large and deep, and he ended up requiring 18 stitches, as he sadly had a history of both depression and self-harm, though this wasn't necessarily widely known at the time. Many have since thought of this as a public expression of his inner turmoil. However, Nicky Wire has spoken about his belief that it was actually an artistic statement, a way to prove those doubting the Manic's devotion to genres like punk wrong, and noted that, quote, "When we were sat in the hospital with the nurse treating him, we both actually felt a little bit guilty at wasting NHS time. Nevertheless, though, the incident was shocking. And as the next few years progressed, it became clear that Richie was dealing with several serious issues in his personal life. He spent time in rehab to help with both his alcohol abuse and self-harm struggles, amongst others. Though Nicky Wire has been sure to point out that one of the biggest misconceptions about Richie is that the last 6 months before he disappeared were reflective of how he was the rest of the time. This is echoed by people like the photographer Valerie Phillips, who took photos of the Manics throughout the band's early years and described Richie as being, quote, "just really lovely and really charming and cool." Of course, both of these things can be true at once. A person can be both absolutely lovely and very troubled. However, it was fairly clear that in the run-up to the 1st of February 1995 that Richie was facing internal battles that no one around him fully understood. So let's take a look at the events that unfolded around that day, before we explore some of the strange and unexplained details that emerged after Richie was officially reported missing. On the 31st of January 1995, then 27-year-old Richie and the Manic's vocalist and lead guitarist James Dean Bradfield were preparing to fly to the US to do some promotional work and were staying at the Embassy Hotel in West London ahead of their scheduled flight the next day. When the morning of the 1st of February rolled around and Richie was nowhere to be seen, the band's manager Martin Hall called his parents back home in Wales to inform them that his room was empty and that they couldn't locate him. Now, even from here at the very start, the timings become a little confusing. For a time, it was believed that Richie checked out of room 561 at the Embassy Hotel at 7 a.m. on the 1st of February, before driving back to his home in Cardiff to drop off items including his passport, credit card and some medication. It was said that he then got back into his car and travelled to a service station near to the Severn Bridge, where he abandoned his vehicle and was never seen again. But information then emerged which contradicted this sequence of events. If you're not familiar with it, the Severn Bridge is a pretty famous landmark which connects England and Wales, and drivers used to have to pay a toll charge to cross over it. When Richie's Vauxhall Cavalier car was discovered at the service station about 2 weeks after he was last seen, it emerged that a receipt from the toll booth had also been found amongst the belongings at his home, and it was initially reported that the timestamp indicated he'd crossed the bridge at 2:55 p.m. on the 1st of February. However, this has since been disputed, as a few years ago it was found that the receipts printed at the time used a 24-hour clock system. So what this actually meant was that the timeline was around 12 hours out, and that Richie had crossed the bridge at 2:55 a.m. in the early hours of the morning on the 1st. So it's therefore likely that the 7 a.m. hotel checkout time had also been incorrect. And it's safe to say that these contradictory and confusing details were the first of many to come to light in the case. Now, because of the proximity of his abandoned car to the Severn Bridge, it was soon speculated that Richie may have tragically taken his own life by jumping from the structure into the water below. But as his sister Rachel has revealed in the years since, this was not the angle the police seemed to be exploring. She told GQ magazine that after eventually seeing the police file on her brother's case, she discovered that despite Richie being considered, quote, high risk due to his history of mental health issues, there were never any searches undertaken within the river, either by boat or helicopter. To be clear, as of me recording this in March of 2026, Richie has never been found, either alive or sadly otherwise. So I can't imagine how upsetting this information was for the family to discover. Rachel explained that the police had believed that Richie had somehow engineered the entire situation, possibly as some kind of publicity stunt or for dramatic effect, and that the authorities even insisted on a 3 a.m. search of their parents' home to try and find evidence to back up their theory. Additionally, she found out that those who had been amongst the last to see Richie before he disappeared had never been interviewed, including a mysterious woman who he was thought to have spent the evening with the night before he went missing. It's said that he tried repeatedly to give her his passport, telling her he would no longer need it, making the fact that she was never interviewed properly just plain bizarre. Rachel has spoken about feeling that the police were less thorough in their investigation because of Richie's public profile, saying that because he was recognizable and well known, that the police believed that more people would therefore be actively looking for him, or at least keeping an eye out, so they didn't have to be as proactive in their official search. And whilst there's no excusing the fact that the police didn't seem to thoroughly investigate every possibility, further odd claims started to surface, which added some fuel to the idea that Richie had chosen to disappear rather than end his life. Let's begin by heading back to a couple of weeks before he vanished. It's widely reported that during this time, Richie had withdrawn around £2,800 from his bank account, taking out about £200 each day to get to the total. Many have suggested that this was because he was due to fly to the US, so he'd want to have the cash to convert into dollars to spend whilst he was there. But others have countered this, questioning whether it was because he planned to leave behind everyone and everything he knew and have the money on hand to begin a new life. And both the theories and the alleged evidence kept coming. A taxi driver came forward, claiming that on the 7th of February, a week after Richie was thought to have left the Embassy Hotel in London, he picked up a man that he later believed to be the missing musician and drove him around various locations within the South Wales valleys, eventually dropping him off at the same service station where his car was later found. Interestingly, some articles about the case imply that Richie's car looked as though it had been lived in. According to The Independent, the battery was completely flat when it was discovered, and it seemed as though the power could have been drained by someone playing cassettes in the vehicle, presumably over a number of days, although there's no definitive proof that either of these events happened, and it's possible that the taxi driver had been mistaken or that the car battery had run flat for a different reason. These details become a lot more compelling when you take into account some of the newer revelations that have been made about Richie's disappearance. In 2019, a book entitled Withdrawn Traces was published with the blessing and cooperation of his sister Rachel, in which the authors Sarah Harris Roberts and Leon Noakes explored the possibilities of what fate could have befallen Richie in extraordinary detail. For now, let's stick with discussing the idea that the 27-year-old did not perish on the 1st of February 1995 and did, in fact, purposefully choose to begin a new life. In the book, it's reported that several members of Richie's family had previously shut themselves off from the wider world, including his great-aunt Bessie, who chose to live a completely reclusive lifestyle in the home she grew up in for over 80 years. Additionally, his uncle Shane had moved away to the US during the 1960s and actively opted to have no contact whatsoever with his family back in Wales for at least 5 years following his relocation. Rachel said that Richie was fascinated by these relatives of theirs and always wanted to know details of their stories, which you can't deny is definitely noteworthy given the context. It's also revealed that Richie was a keen writer of short stories as a child, and in one of these tales, entitled The Rebel, he details a situation in which a character he'd created sighted, concocts a plan to escape where he lives and start a new life abroad. He was also fascinated by novels and poems which involved themes of self-exile, and Sarah has spoken about how, during the course of their research, they were granted access to many of Richie's old books, and a good number of them reflected this fixation on the idea of disappearing. The physical pages of stories which referenced exile would have their corners turned over, and he'd highlight passages which talked about leaving what you know and living a nomadic lifestyle. It was also said that before he disappeared, he handed out copies of a novel he loved to numerous friends. The book in question was A Happy Death by Albert Camus, which is a tale about a man who vanishes in order to try and find what makes him truly happy. So, if we accept that there is a real possibility that Richie did disappear voluntarily, where could he have gone? Well, one of the reasons that some people find this case especially captivating is because there have been some apparent sightings of a man resembling Richie that took place after he went missing. Most sources reference the fact that post-1995, Richie was allegedly spotted in various locations around the world, from the Newport bus station in Wales and the islands of Lanzarote and Fuerteventura to Goa in the west of India. I struggle to find a huge amount of information about the apparent sightings on the Canary Islands, but I did manage to find an article which referenced the Goa incident in more detail. In 1997, a Welsh tourist named Vivian Morris was certain that a man he'd spotted at a beach market in the area, who was referred to as Rick by locals, was in fact Richie Edwards. The man was very lean, and although his hair was now long and unkempt, Vivian thought that his facial features were strikingly similar to Richie's. Despite being sure of who he had seen, Vivian didn't report the sighting until around 4 months afterwards, as he wrestled with the concept of disrupting the man's peace and blowing his cover in the event that it really was the missing musician. Now, it's important to remember that Richie's passport had been left behind when he disappeared, so if he had indeed travelled abroad, he would have somehow had to obtain a new one or a false one, and there's no evidence at all that this happened. In the Withdrawn Traces book, however, there's another intriguing angle that's explored: the idea that Richie may have gone to live in Israel. The year before he vanished, Richie had been a patient at the Whitchurch Hospital in Cardiff, in the psychiatric unit, and whilst he was there, he made a female friend who is thought to have moved to Israel after leaving the unit. Shortly before he disappeared, Richie told his sister Rachel that he would much rather be going to Israel than to the US on the band's scheduled trip, presumably to visit this friend of his. This theory was bolstered when one of the book's co-authors, Leon Noakes, went for a haircut whilst in Cardiff and started talking to the hairdresser about their research into Richie's case. Leon was stunned when the stylist came out and said, quote, "He's actually living in a kibbutz in Israel. Everybody knows." The idea of him residing in one of these communal settlements is particularly interesting when you consider Richie's fascination with being more off the grid. But again, this claim was never officially followed up, and there's nothing to suggest that it is indeed true. So whilst it goes without saying that the hope will always be that Richie is alive and well somewhere out there in the world, his family and friends have been forced to consider the possibility that he is no longer living at various points over the past 3 decades. After years of not wishing to make a definitive decision around Richie's status from a legal perspective, in November of 2008, he was sadly announced to be officially presumed dead in the eyes of the law. This was the only choice the family had in order to be able to properly deal with Richie's financial affairs. And although the alternative option of guardianship is now available, at the time, this was the Edwards' only course of action. Now, I've just mentioned a few reported sightings of Richie that would appear to indicate that he moved abroad and continued to live his life. But there were some other contradictory accounts presented that seemed to suggest the opposite. In 2011, a former postman named David Ramus got in touch with Rachel via social media, informing her that he's positive he had an encounter with Richie on the footpath of the Severn Bridge on the 1st of February 1995, the day he vanished. This is what he wrote to her. Quote, I had no transport, and the only way I could access the bridge was the footpath. I am convinced without a shadow of a doubt that the young lad on the Ost Tower side, who looked extremely surprised at my presence, was your late brother. I was so concerned at his state that I made a detour to the bridge office and reported it. The person who spoke to me did not ask for my name, and I think he was just night security. I have no idea if it was even logged. This must have been unbelievably distressing for Rachel to read, especially the detail about David being concerned about the state Richie seemed to be in, but also because, as she found out years after Richie was last seen, this notion of disappearing by way of the Severn Bridge was a musing her brother looked to have had for a long time. Whilst going through some of his old school books, Rachel found a short story written by Richie when he was just 13, which referenced someone escaping their life by travelling over this exact bridge. Speaking to GQ magazine about this discovery, she said, quote, I did think that was incredible when I found his junior school books. I was astounded by the stories that he'd written in them. Reading the story about the Severn Bridge really took me aback and struck me as something that couldn't really be ignored. To read these words from Richard at that young age, echoing the stories that would surface later in his life, was just astounding. To be 13 years old and to view the bridge in that way was incredible, especially considering what was to come years later. Now, to be clear, this doesn't necessarily mean that Richie was describing taking his life on the bridge, but perhaps more so using the bridge as a way to disappear, possibly by starting a new life elsewhere. But maybe it does show that the location was important to him, poignant even, and if it really was Richie who the postman had spotted there on the day he vanished, it seems like a very significant lead. However, once again, we arrive back to the running theme in this case, which is that there's contradictory evidence when it comes to the theory that Richie may have taken his own life, even whilst he was in the midst of some of his most serious mental and physical health struggles. In the couple of years before he disappeared, Richie spoke openly about how the concept of ending his life, quote, does not enter my mind and never has done in terms of an attempt. Of course, this is a very delicate and sensitive topic, and I would never presume to draw any definitive conclusions from this information, but as it's been widely discussed, I did want to include this quote. In bandmate Nicky Wire's interview with the NME, he also cast doubt on this eventuality. When asked the question, when you talk about him, you use both present and past tense. Have you given up on ever seeing him again? Nicky replied, I don't know if I have really. I'm genuinely so baffled by it sometimes. I know with his intellect that if he had wanted to disappear, he could have pulled it off. He could be living down the effing road. He added, I think that 9 out of 10 people would think that he's not alive anymore, but knowing his brain as I think I did, I can never actually convince myself that there is any outcome yet. There's still things that don't add up. Rachel has echoed this sentiment in as far as she also believes there are no concrete answers in the case. No one knows for sure where Richie is or what happened to him. What she has spoken about is her belief that whatever Richie did, he did so intentionally. When recalling being present at what would turn out to be the Manic Street Preachers' last gig with all 4 members, just a few weeks before Richie went missing, she told GQ magazine, quote, I absolutely think that he'd made a decision. I found out sometime later that he had invited a lot of key people from his life to be there, people who had meant something to him. The people he cared about, he rarely spoke to them about about the band, because he saw himself as a person outside of the band. I believe that whatever he had chosen to do, he had already decided. He knew that was to be his last gig. I'd already seen him on that tour just a few days earlier, so the fact he'd invited myself and all of those people to that one gig speaks volumes now. If I'd only known that then. What he had decided, I don't know, but he had decided. Despite holding this belief, it does seem that Rachel is still open to exploring alternative and incredibly difficult possibilities, if it means that some vital evidence could come to light as a result. In the Withdrawn Traces book, there is a third option that's discussed. The idea that Richie could have met with some kind of foul play. I suppose that logically it makes sense that this would be a consideration, especially after all this time has gone by. We know that Richie's body has never been recovered. From articles I've read, it seems as though there have been some potential false alarms over the years, in terms of, for example, fishermen thinking they'd found remains in the River Severn that could be Richie's, but no confirmed trace of him has ever been discovered. On the other side of the coin, none of the apparent sightings of him have ever been confirmed to be true or false. We know that Richie has several distinguishing features, including visible and distinctive tattoos on his arms, and of course, the scars from the incident where he etched the phrase "for real" onto his skin. As awful as it is to think about, when someone appears to vanish into thin air, it's understandable that the possibilities that he could have been taken against his will, or even ultimately killed, are considered. The book's co-author, Sarah, has spoken about the importance of exploring every avenue and question whether there may have been someone out there who wished harm on Richie. Strangely enough, after Rachel did a magazine interview in 2018, she received a message from a man in Ireland claiming that Richie had actually hired a hitman to kill him and make sure his body was dealt with afterwards. While Sarah acknowledged that the claim was wild but ultimately still a possibility in a case where everything seems so strange already, Rachel concluded that it sounded just too far-fetched to be true. She has, however, considered that Richie may have been coerced into disappearing by someone who was blackmailing him, a theory she arrived at after watching the documentary Who Took Johnny. After all, he was a well-known public figure, and it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility that he could be targeted in such a way. But like with almost every other thread in this story, this idea has never led to a conclusion and remains a source of yet further unanswered questions. I didn't want to end this episode without expressing just how incredible of a person I think Richie's sister Rachel is. Tragically, their parents, Graham and Sherry, have now both passed away, and Rachel has spoken about being the only one left in her family continuing the search for new information about her brother's whereabouts. 31 years on from Richie's disappearance, Rachel still works with charities like Missing People to ensure that her sibling's story is not forgotten, and continues to urge anyone with information that could help provide answers to come forward. Of course, I'll be including links to these recent appeals in the show notes or description box. Something that really struck me about this case is how different it could have been had the year been, say, 2005 instead of 1995. I wonder whether the police may have been more on the ball with things like CCTV analysis or DNA collections, and they would possibly have had more evidence at hand due to things like mobile phone data, for example, whilst the honest truth is that we simply do not know what happened to Richie Edwards, which is why his story remains one of the biggest mysteries in British musical history. I stand with those who know and love him in the belief that he may very well still be out there somewhere, living a new life on his own terms. Whatever the truth may be, I hope with all my heart that Rachel receives some solid answers one day soon. Wherever Richie Edwards is, I hope that he's at peace. Oh, this was such a heartbreaking case to cover, and one that I know is going to stick with me for a very long time. As always, I will be providing links in the show notes and description to mental health resources, as well as the missing persons appeals information I noted too. Like with all of our episodes, I encourage you to share your own thoughts and ideas in the comment section, but due to the nature of this case, please do be extra thoughtful when getting involved in the conversation. Had you heard about Richey Edwards' disappearance before? Were there any particular parts of this case that made you sit up and pay extra close attention because they just seemed especially strange? I'll be right there with you in the comments continuing this discussion. But before we end this episode today, we still have one last section to go. So without further ado, it's time to change gears and head on over to our outro feature, Weird Media. After heavier stories like this one, I always like to try and recommend something much more light-hearted. And the shout out I have for you today is probably arriving about 15 years too late, but it's still well worth it. Towards the end of last year, I decided it was time to finally watch a series I'd seen so many clips of on social media. I knew there were 11 seasons, so I'd have plenty to go at, and I have absolutely loved it. And the show in question is Modern Family. Now, whether you're someone who consumes a lot of true crime content or other serious media, or you're like me and you both consume it and create it, you sometimes just need a total palate cleanser. And Modern Family has become that for me without a doubt. So if you've never watched it, here's the basic premise. It focuses on 3 branches of the same family. So you have Jay, his son Mitchell's family, and his daughter Claire's family. Jay marries a woman named Gloria, who's played by Sofia Vergara, and her son Manny becomes his stepchild. Mitchell is married to Cam, and they adopt a daughter named Lily. And Claire is married to Phil, and they have 3 kids, Hayley, Alex, and Luke. It's a comedy about the dynamics of their family, and it's just become such a comfort show for me. The episodes are around 20 minutes long, and I love that the show carries storylines through year on year, even though each individual episode has its own dedicated plot. A few of the episodes are these really clever, almost theatre-esque scenarios, where each family's stories are interwoven with the others, and it builds to some kind of disastrous or hilarious conclusion, often both at the same time, to be honest. I watch Modern Family on Disney Plus, but I'm sure it's available elsewhere too, and it's the perfect show to have on whilst you're cooking or winding down before bed. It never fails to cheer me up. I only have a few episodes left to watch, and I really don't want it to end, but I know I'm going to rewatch it multiple times in the future, which is the great thing about this genre of program. If anyone has any other similar shows that they would recommend, please do leave them in the comments too. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think we can ever have enough of them. A huge thank you for tuning into the podcast today. I know this was a super heavy story. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including shout outs to all of the sources I used during my research, along with links so that you can click through and do some further reading. And definitely be sure to check out the Withdrawn Traces book if you'd like the full deep dive. I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address too. Please do leave us a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or get in touch on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, or even TikTok, and let me know your thoughts on today's story. If you have a spare moment, a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts is always genuinely appreciated. It really is one of the best free ways to support the show. And if you're watching on YouTube today, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for joining me today, and I'll see you again next week for a brand new Strange But True episode. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, for the good kind of weird.